The wind swept across the Arizona prairie, warm and dry as a breath from another world, carrying the scent of dust, sage, and something faintly sorrowful, like an old song the land had never forgotten. The sun was sinking behind the red cliffs, turning the sky into rivers of gold and blood. Jonas Hale rode alone, his shadow long and silent against the dying light. There was a calmness about him that came only to men who had lived through war and lost everything they once called home. His grey eyes, cold and unflinching, studied the horizon with a patience born of grief. Each hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat against the emptiness. It had been 3 years since he had last spoken to another soul for longer than a trade of supplies. 3 years since laughter had passed his lips or another voice had answered him at dawn. The war had left its scars, not only on his body, but in the quiet hollows of his heart, where memories lay buried like bones beneath dry earth. Yet, on that evening, something pulled him from his routine path. An instinct, a tremor in the stillness, a whisper that wasn't wind. His horse snorted, ears flicking toward the brush ahead. Jonas dismounted. The silence was too deep, too tense. He moved like a shadow, boots brushing through brittle grass. And then he saw her, a small figure, curled against the roots of a juniper tree, skin marked by dirt and pain. An Apache child, barely alive, her breaths shallow as though the air itself had forgotten how to fill her lungs. Her eyes opened when his shadow fell across her, wide and dark, reflecting fear and exhaustion. For a moment he froze. The war had taught him to be cautious of tribes and men alike, but this was only a starving child. He reached into his coat, drew out a piece of dry bread, and placed it beside her lips. She hesitated, trembling. When hunger overcame fear, she took a bite so small it nearly broke him. Tears streaked her dusty cheeks, cutting pale rivers down the grime. Jonas said nothing. He only knelt, watching as she ate like a creature who had forgotten kindness existed. He touched her forehead, burning hot. Fever. Without another thought, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, fragile as a prayer carried by the wind. The ride back to his cabin felt endless. Dusk thickened into night, and the mountains swallowed the last of the light. His horse's hooves struck the earth in slow rhythm, a steady reminder of the fragile heartbeat he cradled against his chest. By the time he reached his small wooden home, the stars had scattered across the sky, cold and endless. Inside, the air smelled of pine smoke and solitude. He laid the girl gently on his bed, covered her with his coat, and stoked the fire until it blazed warm again. Jonas sat by her side long after she fell into fitful sleep. The flickering flames carved faint lines on his face, catching the hollowness beneath his eyes. Once there had been a wife in this room, her laughter curling through the air like spring rain. Once there had been a child's cradle in the corner, now only dust. He had sealed those memories away long ago, but the small hand lying limp beside the blanket broke open a part of him he thought long dead. Outside, coyotes called to the moon. Inside, the cabin held a new kind of silence, no longer empty, but fragile, expectant. Something had changed. Jonas could feel it in the warmth that crept back into the air, in the faint breath of the little girl who clung to life as if guided by something unseen. It wasn't just the fire keeping her alive. It was the world, pausing to remember mercy. When dawn came, Pale light spilled through the cracks of the window, painting her face gold. Her chest rose and fell with a steadier rhythm now. Jonas leaned forward, his hand brushing a stray lock of black hair from her forehead. The gesture surprised even him. He had not touched another being with such tenderness in years. There was something healing in it, something that reached beyond words, like the land itself exhaled in relief. Then came the sound, soft, distant, but deliberate. Footsteps outside the door. His instincts snapped awake. He reached for the revolver resting on the table, the metal cold against his palm. The wind pressed against the cabin, carrying a murmur of movement, a presence that did not belong to the dawn. He opened the door just as the first light touched the porch. A figure stood there, tall, barefoot, eyes dark and fierce as storm clouds, her black hair tangled in the wind, her clothes torn from travel. She carried a bone knife in one hand and the wildness of the desert in her stance. "Where is the child?" she demanded, her voice raw, trembling between fear and fury. Jonas didn't speak at first. His eyes met hers, steady as iron. "Inside," he said finally. "She's safe." The woman stepped past him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The moment her gaze fell on the small figure wrapped in blankets, her knees gave way. A sound escaped her, half sob, half prayer. She rushed forward, clutching the girl to her chest. Tears streaked the dust on her face, and words in Apache slipped from her trembling lips. Jonas stood back, unsure, the gun still heavy in his hand, but something in that raw human cry loosened his grip. When she finally turned toward him, her expression had changed. There was gratitude there, but also something ancient and solemn. "I am Nara," she said, her voice quieter now, trembling like a flame in wind. "You saved my daughter. According to our law, my body is yours." Jonas froze. The fire crackled behind him, throwing shadows across the walls. He had heard stories of such vows, of women offering themselves as repayment, as protection, but he had never believed in them. He wanted to speak, to tell her that he wanted no such thing, that he only did what anyone with a heart might have done. But when his gaze met hers, he saw something beyond the words, a plea, a silent grief carried through too many nights of running. "Stay," he said softly. "Both of you. This house is safe." For a long time she said nothing. The child stirred against her, breathing easier now. Then, with a quiet nod, Nara laid her daughter back onto the bed, her fingers brushing Jonas's coat that covered the little one. There was disbelief in her eyes, and relief she dared not name. For the first time, no man had demanded her as payment. He had offered safety instead. Outside, dawn climbed higher, gilding the peaks in light. Inside that worn wooden cabin, 3 lives, each scarred, each lonely, breathed the same air for the first time. The silence no longer felt like mourning. It felt like beginning. Jonas stepped outside, the chill wind brushing his hair, the smell of earth and smoke heavy in the air. The world was vast, untamed, and full of ghosts, but somewhere behind him, inside that small house, was the faint sound of life returning. And as the sun rose over the hills, he felt something warm stir within him, something that whispered of healing, of home, of a story not yet written. If you're still here, riding beside this tale through the dust and wind, Let your heart linger a moment longer. Tap the like if the prairie spoke to you tonight. Leave your thoughts in the wind below. Every word you share keeps these fires burning. And if your soul found a spark of warmth in this lonely beginning, subscribe and stay a while, because sometimes even the coldest stories can find their way back to light. The day stretched wide and golden ahead. Somewhere inside that cabin, the child began to breathe more steadily, and the woman who had lost everything found a reason to hope again. Jonas turned his gaze to the horizon, not knowing that what began as mercy would soon become love, and that the path ahead would lead them all into a new kind of healing, where two broken souls would learn that even in the wildest lands, hearts can find their home. Morning came softly, washing the plains in pale light that shimmered over the dry grass like a quiet prayer. Inside the cabin, the world had shifted overnight. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the faint sound of breathing filled the once empty space. Jonas stood near the door, mug of coffee in hand, watching the woman and her child from a careful distance. Nara sat by the hearth, her broad shoulders slightly bent as she fed the fire. Her movements were rough, uncertain. Hands that once drew a bow now fumbled clumsily with the ladle and the burning coals. Yet there was patience in the way she worked, a quiet determination not to appear weak in the home of a stranger. Jonas took another sip of coffee. The warmth spread through his chest, easing the stiffness of his bones. It had been so long since another human presence had filled his mornings that he almost didn't recognize the sensation. The silence felt different now, not hollow, but full of fragile life. Ayoka stirred under the blanket, blinking her dark eyes open. When she saw her mother kneeling by the fire, a faint smile spread across her small, cracked lips. Nara turned, and for an instant the warrior in her vanished, leaving only the softness of a mother's gaze. Jonas set his mug aside and stepped closer. "She needs water," he murmured. Nara hesitated before nodding. He filled a tin cup from the jug and offered it to her. Their fingers brushed as she reached out, a fleeting touch, nothing more, but it sent a small tremor through the air. She guided the cup to her daughter's lips, whispering something in Apache, her voice low and melodic. Ayoka drank in slow, weak sips. Then she looked up at Jonas, eyes bright with something he hadn't seen in years. Trust. Nara noticed it too. Her gaze flicked to Jonas's face, measuring him once more. There was caution there, but less fear than before. The firelight glowed across her skin, revealing faint scars tracing her collarbone and shoulder, remnants of battles fought and survived. Jonas looked away, feeling a strange warmth stir in his chest. Not desire, not yet, but an ache for the gentleness that war had taken from both of them. When the girl finished drinking, Jonas stepped outside to tend to the horses. The sun had climbed higher now, gold spilling across the fields. He repaired the old fence, each hammer strike echoing through the still air. For years, work had been his refuge, mechanical, thoughtless, safe. But now, every sound from the cabin pulled at him. The laughter of a child, the rustle of movement, the scent of firewood and porridge. It was like the world was reminding him he was still alive. Inside, Nara stared at the pot of porridge she had burned. The thick, blackened paste clung stubbornly to the bottom. When Jonas returned, she stood rigid, her expression hard as stone. She expected mockery, scorn, perhaps a cruel smile. Instead, Jonas simply lifted the pot, poured in water, stirred it gently, and set it back over the flame. "Too hot a fire," he said, his voice calm. "Takes patience." She blinked, surprised by the kindness. "In my tribe," she murmured, "we cook in the open, with the wind. Fire moves freely." He nodded. "Fire's the same everywhere. It just needs room to breathe." Their eyes met, his grey, steady, hers dark and restless. In that look, something unspoken passed between them. The tension in her shoulders eased, and for the first time she didn't stand like someone ready to flee. By noon, the cabin was filled with a thin warmth and the faint aroma of food. Ayoka laughed softly, tapping her spoon against the bowl. Her mother smiled, a real smile, hesitant but alive. Jonas sat across the table, pretending to fix his belt buckle, but his gaze lingered on the scene before him. It was simple, ordinary, yet it felt like a miracle. When Nara caught him looking, she said nothing. But in the faint curve of her lips, he sensed understanding. She wasn't used to tenderness either. She had learned to hide her emotions behind silence, just as he did. Perhaps that was why the air between them felt strangely peaceful, as though both carried wounds the other could recognize without words. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. Jonas worked outside, mending the roof and hauling water from the well. From time to time, he caught glimpses of Nara through the open door, her strong figure moving carefully around the cabin, her hair loose, dark strands glinting under the sunlight. Once he saw her kneeling beside the child, weaving a small toy from reeds. The sight struck him with a tenderness he hadn't expected. He turned away quickly, heart heavy with something close to longing, but not the kind that burns. It was soft, healing, like rain on parched earth. As twilight deepened, he stacked wood by the door. The prairie turned golden, then purple, then blue. Inside, Ayoka had fallen asleep again, her small hand clutching the woven toy. Nara sat by the window, gazing out at the fading light. The firelight caught her profile. Strong jawline, full lips, the curve of exhaustion softened by peace. Jonas paused at the doorway, watching quietly. "You've been running for a long time," he said finally, his voice gentle. She didn't turn. "Yes? From who?" "From men who take what they want," she answered. "From those who see us as less than human." Her tone was steady, but beneath it lay years of pain. Jonas walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "You're safe here," he said. Nara's hands tightened in her lap. Safety is a word made of wind. It never stays. He thought of his own ghosts, the war, the graves he left behind. "Sometimes," he replied, "wind can carry warmth too." Her head tilted slightly at his words, as if trying to believe them. For a moment, the silence between them softened. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, whispering through the tall grass like a lullaby. That night, when Jonas laid out the blankets for them, Nara hesitated. Her hand brushed the thick fabric, and she whispered, "Even this body I do not need to give. I only want my daughter to live well." Jonas looked at her for a long time, the shadows of the fire dancing between them. "I don't want what you offer," he said quietly. "I want you both to live." The words lingered in the air, fragile and sincere. Nara bowed her head, unsure what to do with a kindness that asked for nothing in return. She had seen men look at her with hunger, but never with gentleness. It unsettled her more than threats ever could. Jonas stepped outside, lighting a cigarette, the smoke curling into the cold night air. He stood beneath the stars, feeling the earth settle around him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel utterly alone. Behind the cabin walls, he heard the faint sound of breathing, the rhythm of two lives sheltered by his roof. It brought a strange peace, one that crept slowly into his bones, mending something he hadn't realized was broken. Inside, Nara lay awake beside her daughter, staring at the wooden ceiling. Her thoughts wandered to the man outside, the way his eyes carried silence, the way he moved without cruelty. There was strength in him, but also sorrow, and perhaps in that sorrow she saw a reflection of her own. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, not to the spirits of her tribe or the god of white men, but to the night itself, to let this peace, however brief, last one more sunrise. Jonas flicked the cigarette into the dust, the ember dying like a fallen star. He lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the moon hung low and heavy. Somewhere deep inside him, something began to thaw, the slow, patient melting of ice after a long winter. When he stepped back into the cabin, the fire was burning low, the air warm and still. Nara was asleep now, one arm wrapped protectively around her child. He stood in the doorway, watching them in silence. The lines of tension had eased from her face, leaving behind a softness that was almost painful to look at. Jonas sat down in the chair beside the bed. His breath slowed, sinking unconsciously with theirs. The scent of smoke, the rhythm of breathing, the quiet heartbeat of the house, it all wove together into something sacred. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, sleep came easily. Outside, the night held steady, the prairie breathing beneath the stars. Healing had begun, not through words or promises, but through the simple miracle of three lost souls finding shelter in the same light. The wind carried a whisper across the plains, as if blessing the small cabin with its ancient wisdom. Even after fire and pain, love always finds a way to return. And beneath that whisper, unseen but certain, something tender was beginning to take root. A seed of warmth buried deep in the cold soil of two lonely hearts. Quiet, patient, waiting for its time to bloom with the morning. The days that followed unfolded with a gentleness that neither Jonas nor Nara had known in years. Morning sunlight poured through the narrow window, painting warm stripes across the wooden floor. The scent of coffee and pine smoke lingered in the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of life returning. Ayoka's laughter had become a daily miracle, a soft bell-like sound that melted the silence clinging to the cabin's walls. Each morning, Jonas would hear her giggle as she tried to mimic the cry of a meadowlark outside, and each time something deep in his chest stirred, fragile and healing. The prairie had begun to breathe again. Grass that had been brittle from drought shimmered under the dew. Jonas woke early to tend the horses, his boots pressing into the cold earth as the horizon stretched wide before him. For years he had lived like a ghost, surviving on habit and memory. Now, each dawn brought a reason to move with purpose. The knowledge that two lives depended on him gave his solitude a heartbeat. When he returned from the fields, Nara would already be awake. Sometimes she sat on the porch, sharpening a blade or brushing Ayoka's tangled hair. Other times she struggled with household chores, clumsy yet unyielding, determined to learn. She refused pity, but Jonas offered quiet guidance when her frustration grew. He showed her how to balance the kettle so the fire burned evenly, how to mend torn cloth, how to patch a broken latch on the door. Their words were few, but their silence spoke with the tenderness of people learning to trust the world again. One morning, as the wind shifted from the east, Jonas saw Nara standing barefoot in the grass. Her long hair lifted with the breeze, her face turned toward the sun. There was something wild and sacred in that sight. A woman who had known pain yet stood unbroken, her strength woven with grace. He watched her for a moment before returning to his work, unwilling to disturb that quiet moment of beauty. But later, when their eyes met across the field, she smiled faintly, and the world seemed to pause. Inside the cabin, Ayoka recovered quickly. The fever faded, replaced by the endless energy of childhood. She followed Jonas like a small shadow, curious about everything he did. She touched the reins, the rifle, the spurs on his boots, asking questions with her eyes when her English failed her. Jonas answered in gestures, showing her how to feed the horses, how to stroke their necks so they calmed beneath her hand. Sometimes she would laugh and run to her mother, babbling in Apache about the white man with eyes like stone who speaks with kindness. Nara watched them from the doorway, the ache in her chest both painful and sweet. She had not seen Ayoka laugh like this since her husband's death, since their tribe had scattered across the desert under fire and hunger. In Jonas's quiet presence, something impossible had begun to bloom. A sense of peace, as fragile as spring water. That evening, as twilight deepened, Nara prepared a small meal. Her cooking had improved, the porridge no longer burned, and the beans had flavor. Jonas sat at the table, watching her move about the room with growing ease. The firelight brushed gold against her skin, catching the curve of her neck, the faint scar along her shoulder. There was strength in every motion, but also gentleness, the kind that came from surviving storms without letting them harden her heart completely. When they ate, Ayoka's laughter filled the air again, spilling warmth into every corner. Jonas found himself smiling without meaning to. Afterward, he helped Nara wash the bowls. Their hands met in the basin once, and both froze. The water rippled softly around their fingers, warm against the chill of the evening. Neither spoke, but in that silence, something wordless passed between them, an understanding, a shared ache, a fragile thread pulling them closer. Later that night, the sky burned with stars. Jonas sat on the porch, the wind brushing gently against his face. He could hear Nara humming softly to Ayoka inside, a lullaby in a language he didn't know, full of tenderness and sorrow. It carried through the night air like a prayer, and Jonas closed his eyes, letting it sink into him. The melody seemed to reach the deepest parts of his being, the wounds he had hidden from the world. It was a song of healing, of love that refused to die even when the world tried to break it. When Nara stepped out after putting Ayoka to bed, Jonas looked up. She stood quietly for a moment, then joined him on the steps. The firelight flickered behind them, soft and steady. "She dreams again," Nara said, her voice low, "of rivers and home." "She's strong," Jonas replied. Like her mother. A faint smile touched her lips. Strength doesn't keep you safe. Sometimes it just keeps you from breaking too soon. He turned toward her, his gaze steady. You've kept her alive. That's more than most ever manage. Nara's eyes met his, the darkness in them shimmering with something new. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. You've given her peace, she whispered. Even for a few days. That is more healing than I can ever repay. Jonas shook his head. Peace isn't mine to give. Maybe it's something we all share when we stop fighting it. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the rustle of grass and the distant cry of coyotes. The night was cool, and the stars stretched endless above them. Jonas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden carving. A bird he had whittled years ago, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight. He handed it to her without a word. She turned it over in her palm, tracing the lines with her thumb. You made this? Yes, for a child who never came. The weight of that confession hung between them. Nara looked up, and her eyes softened. The spirits brought you another, she said gently. And they brought her mother too. Jonas exhaled slowly, his heart tightening. Maybe so. The fire crackled inside, the soft glow spilling through the cracks of the door. Nara looked toward it, her expression thoughtful. My people believe that souls meet again in every life, sometimes as kin, sometimes as strangers who find each other when the world grows too cold. He watched her profile against the starlight, and something inside him yielded, like earth after rain. Then maybe this is one of those times, he said. Her breath caught, and for a fleeting instant her hand brushed his. It was a small gesture, accidental perhaps, but it lingered like warmth spreading through the air. Inside the cabin the fire dimmed. Outside the wind softened to a whisper, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke. Jonas felt the world slowing, his heartbeat sinking with the stillness around them. There was no need for words, no need for promises. In the quiet, everything they could not say found its way between them, pain, forgiveness, longing, and the first traces of love that did not demand, only healed. The next morning arrived with a hush of silver light. Ayoka ran barefoot through the grass, her laughter echoing over the hills. Jonas saddled his horse and glanced back toward the cabin. Nara stood at the doorway, arms folded, watching her daughter. When their eyes met, there was something unspoken there, trust beginning to root itself. He tipped his hat lightly before riding out toward the fields. The sun rose higher, bathing everything in warmth. Behind him, the cabin no longer looked like a place of solitude. Smoke rose from its chimney like a sign of life renewed. For the first time in many years, Jonas felt the faint pulse of belonging. He carried it with him through the day, the memory of laughter, the soft voice of a woman by the fire, and the fragile hope that maybe, after all the dust and blood, he was allowed to begin again. As dusk fell, he returned to find the cabin alive with light. Ayoka was drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick, and Nara was humming that same ancient song, her voice weaving through the cool air. Jonas paused, watching them, feeling the warmth of the scene wrap around him like a blanket against the cold. Something in him settled then, a deep, quiet certainty that he no longer stood alone on the edge of the world. He walked toward them, his footsteps soft, his heart steady. And as night embraced the land once more, the cabin glowed from within like a lantern in the wilderness. The wounds of the past had not vanished, but they no longer bled. They were scars now, beautiful in their own way, reminders that even pain can lead to grace. The prairie wind sighed through the tall grass, carrying the scent of wood smoke and hope. Beneath that endless sky, 3 lives intertwined by chance had begun to heal, not through miracles, but through small, steadfast acts of kindness that whispered softly of love. Far off, the horizon shimmered with the promise of tomorrow, and Jonas knew that whatever waited beyond it, he would not face it alone. The story that had begun in silence was slowly learning how to speak in the language of the heart, and every breath, every glance, every shared sunrise became a quiet hymn to the healing power of love. The season turned quietly, the way a heart turns toward light without telling the mouth. Days stretched long and honey-colored, nights folded close and kind. In the hollow between them, a rhythm settled, wood to cut, a well to coax back into generosity, a gate to mend, a child to coax into laughter. Jonas learned the weight of Ayoka on his shoulders when she begged to see the world from the height of a man. Nara learned the precise tilt of the kettle that would not scald porridge or pride. They learned where each creaking board lay in the floor and how to step around it when sleep had finally found the house. Healing came like spring water, not a river's roar, just a steady trickle that never stopped. One afternoon, while the sun was bright enough to bleach the horizon to bone, Jonas led the mare to browse near the scrub. Wind combed the grass in long silver strokes. He felt the land with his boots the way a blind man reads a face, patiently, for truth beneath the surface. That was when he saw them, 3 crescents pressed deep into the dry dirt beyond the north fence, the kind of hoofprints made by horses carrying men who did not spare their animals or their temper. He crouched and touched the edge of one print, the way a healer touches a pulse. How long? Not long. The wind had licked at them, but not yet smoothed their edges. He lifted his head and listened. The prairie seemed to be holding its breath. He took a slow walk along the fence line, eyes skimming for the kind of careless mistake men make when they think the world belongs to them. A piece of frayed rope snagged on a mesquite thorn, a tobacco twist trampled under heel. He gathered both and pocketed them, not as trophies, only as proof. When he returned to the yard, he didn't call out. He stood a moment and watched the house, the small smoke of it, the tilt of its roof like an old hat a man refuses to give up, the quiet that had learned to include 3 breaths. He set his hands on the porch rail, feeling the grain beneath his palms, and then stepped inside. Nara looked up from the wash basin. Ayoka sat on the floor beside her, arranging smooth pebbles into circles and lines, the way children write prayers their mouths haven't learned yet. Nara's eyes narrowed slightly, a hawk catching movement no one else sees. She did not ask. She waited. "Riders," Jonas said. 3 for sure. Maybe more, farther back. Came close enough to measure the house. Ayoka's hand hovered over a stone and then set it down carefully, as if stones could keep a secret safer when they were in the right place. Nara dried her hands on her skirt and stood. "How long?" she asked. "An hour, perhaps 2. She looked toward the door, not with panic, but with the kind of attention that honors danger without awarding it kingship. "Then we make a room for courage," she said. They did not move quickly. They moved right. Jonas checked the hinges on the back door, then the latch. He took down the Winchester, not with the old bitterness, but with a new reverence. A tool's strength called for a clean purpose. Nara gathered the arrows and wrapped several tips with rags, setting a small iron plate near the coals. She tested the drawer that hid the loose floor plank with the tunnel of safety beneath. Ayoka watched them both, solemn and bright, her small shoulders squared the way a child squares them when she decides to be the hero of her own secret story. Jonas crouched to the girl's height. "There is a hiding place," he said. "If we ask you to climb in, you go. You take water. You breathe slow, and think of rivers." He looked to Nara. The words were hers as much as his now. Ayoka nodded, and her chin lifted by a finger's width as if to say, "I will be the river." Later, when shadow stretched long as a cat in the warm doorway, Jonas walked the perimeter again. The prints had multiplied near the outer rise. He tried not to count. Numbers have their uses. Sometimes they have too much power. From the ridge, a vulture drew a grey circle in the sky, the same circle it had drawn yesterday and the day before. He did not prefer the omen, and did not refuse it either. He returned to the porch and found Nara at the threshold, hair braided back, eyes dark and clear. She held out a strip of dried meat. He took it and ate, and the ordinary taste steadied him. "They will speak first," she said. "Men who want to take always speak first. They like to hear their voices fill the distance they cannot cross." "Let them waste their breath," Jonas answered. He wanted to reach for her hand. He did not. The wanting itself felt like a wound mending, the ache not of harm, but of knit. She read the thought without any need for words. She lifted her palm and touched the doorframe instead. It seemed to calm the wood. It calmed him. They waited. Waiting is a craft as delicate as beading. Done poorly, it breaks. Done well, it makes something beautiful out of fear. The sun slipped lower, turning the dry grass to flickers of copper. When the riders came, they came the way storms do. First a hush, then a smell, then a sound like drum beats far away. The horses appeared as smudges, then men formed around them, dust-bearded, lean, eyes like chips of glass. One at the center wore a fur-lined coat as if winter obeyed him. He smiled as if his smile had ever changed anyone's fate. He reined in at a respectable distance, the distance of a sermon delivered by a man who believes he is God's mouth. "Afternoon," he called. "Fine day to end a misunderstanding." Jonas stepped onto the porch. The boards remembered his weight. The rifle lay near the door inside, neither hidden nor displayed. "There is no misunderstanding," he said. The bearded man spread his hands. "You've got something that strayed from decent commerce. We're here to put it back in the stream. We don't mind paying you for the trouble of sheltering stolen property." His eyes slipped past Jonas, the way snakes slip through grass, hunting for a smaller animal. "Woman? Girl?" "I'll take them gentle if you don't make me take them rough." Nara's shape filled the doorway then, quiet, controlled. She did not glare, she did not lower her eyes either. She stood the way cliffs stand, present, inevitable, carved by time but unbowed. Ayoka's shadow flickered behind her mother's knees, a small bird learning stillness. "This is a home," Jonas said. Homes are not market stalls. We don't do your kind of business." The man clicked his tongue and looked down at his reins as if pitying a child who had miscounted cows. "Everything's a market stall if you bring the right coin," he said. He looked up again, and the coin he offered was threat. "Or the right fire." Jonas's face did not change. Men like this learned, if they learned at all, from what did not move. "There's nothing for you here," he said. "Ride on." The man's smile peeled back thinner. Around him, a few of his riders shifted in the saddle, the way men shift when an audience is small and they must perform anyway. He leaned forward. "Tell me, Hale, is it your him or hers that's got you forgetting which side of the world you live on? You ain't the law. You're a rock with a door. Rocks crack. Doors burn." "Some rocks grow roots," Jonas said. "Some doors are watched." Silence took the dust and packed it tight. Somewhere, a cricket thought better of its song. The bearded man lifted his hand as if to scratch his jaw, and the motion rippled down the line, men tipping their shoulders, angling their hips, the body's grammar for harm. Jonas felt the old muscle memory rise, then drift, then settle, not as anger, but as clarity. If they rode forward, he would answer cleanly. If they spun away, he would not bless them with a bullet's chase. The purpose here was not victory. It was belonging. "Fine," the bearded man said, letting the word fall like a coin he had decided was counterfeit. "We'll let you count your blessings and your bullets for a day or two. It will make the lesson sweeter." He pointed a gloved finger like a child pretending at trial. "When we come back, bring the woman to the yard and the girl with her. When we come back, bring your pride too, so I don't have to hunt it through your house." Jonas did not make a speech. He did not spit either. He knew the worth of gestures. He only said, "Go," and the word contained both an order and a truth. You do not belong here. They turned their horses with more swagger than grace and rode off. At the crest of the ridge, the bearded man twisted in his saddle and smiled a last time with the heartbreak of a spoiled boy. "See you soon," he sang, and it sounded like an ugly lullaby. When they were gone, the world did not yet release its breath. It waited to see what the house would do. Jonas stepped back inside and closed the door with a careful hand. He looked at Nara, and though no one had been taken, both of them felt the absence something leaves when it has been threatened, like a shadow pulled too hard across a wall. Ayoka's voice, small and even, reached the space between them. "Will they take our bread?" she asked, maybe meaning bread, maybe meaning everything. "No," Jonas said, "not our bread." Nara knelt and took the girl's face in her hands. "Not our songs," she added, "not our fire, not our names." Ayoka blinked slowly, as if memorizing the inventory of what could not be taken. She nodded, satisfied for now, and returned to her stones, rearranging them with new intention. Circles inside circles, lines crossing, a tiny gate opening toward a tiny river. As afternoon leaned into evening, they set to work in the quiet way that makes rooms strong. Jonas dragged the heavy trunk to the back door and wedged it so a boot would have to argue with oak instead of pine. He mixed sand and ash in the wash basin and placed it near a window where a hand with a torch might hope to run. He oiled the rifle, then the hinges. He counted their water and did not find it lacking. On the porch, he moved the bench an inch to the left, balancing the view it offered against the risk of exposure. It was the sort of geometry that fixes the heart as surely as it fixes the furniture. Nara laid out the arrows and measured her breath against their number. She collected cloth, oil, and patience. She sharpened the knife with strokes that were firm but not angry. Anger makes steel mean, and she needed it honest. She stitched a pouch that fitted her side for the small things a fight asks of a woman. Matches, a lucky bead from her mother, a strip of leather for tying courage to the wrist. When the chores were done, they sat on the steps and let the sun lower itself without help. The land glowed the color of peach flesh, then copper, then ash. Jonas thought of the old days when a day like this would have ended in whiskey and a fight. Now it ended in tea and a vow. He had not yet spoken the vow aloud. He didn't need to. He felt it move through him like a second bloodstream, quiet and absolute. I will stand where I am needed. I will stay. Nara spoke first, her voice soft enough to fold, strong enough to carry. When I ran, I told myself I was a river, but rivers need banks. She tilted her head toward the cabin. This is a bank. He looked out over the field, where the wind drew its delicate fingers through the grass. I told myself I was a mountain. Mountains don't move. Sometimes they should. She smiled then, small, rare, catching the last light at the corner of her mouth. Then let us be a valley, she said. A place where things can grow. They let that image rise and settle between them. It made the air easier to breathe. Later, while Ayoka washed her face and hands at the basin with care that looked like ritual, Jonas reached into the drawer by the hearth and pulled out a small square of folded cloth. He opened it to reveal 3 seeds, dry, dark, oval, saved for a spring that had never come. Hollyhocks, he said. She wanted them. I told her this land would spit them out and call me a fool for trying. He did not say she, his wife. He didn't have to. The past did not ask to be named. It asked to be honored. Nara's fingers were gentler than wind as she touched one seed. Stubborn beauty, she murmured, reading the memory he had not spoken. Let us be fools together. They went out to the east side of the house, where the morning sun would be first to forgive the earth its hardness. Jonas knelt and dug a shallow line with the pocket-knife he had sharpened 1,000 times. Nara placed the seeds evenly, her hands steady. Ayoka pressed the soil back with her small palm and looked up, as if asking the sky to oversee what they had hidden. When they rose, soil dusted all their fingers. Nara lifted her hand to Jonas's and brushed the dirt away. He did the same for hers. It felt like a ceremony that asked for no witnesses but the patient moon. Night came with the hush of a quilt settling over a sleeping child. They banked the fire low, left the lamp in the window, and arranged themselves in the now familiar constellation. Ayoka between them on the pallet, Jonas in the chair. But something in the arrangement had changed. It was not the positions, it was the part of their spirits that faced outward. They did not meet darkness with fear. They met it with attention and with a steadiness that can look like love because it is. Ayoka slept quickly, spent from the day's careful courage. Nara lay with one hand near her daughter's shoulder, the other palm open against the floorboard, as if listening to the house's heartbeat. Jonas kept to the chair with the rifle within reach, as always, but his hands rested on his knees, loose, prepared without tightening. He watched the windows blur to black, the reflection of the lamp trembling slightly like a star discovering itself in a puddle. His mind did not race the way it once had on nights before fight. It moved in the manner of a shepherd, making slow counts, circling back, counting again, gathering strays. In the middle watch, a breeze shouldered through the cracks and lifted a curl of Nara's hair from her cheek. Jonas stood and, without touching skin, settled it back with the faintest stir of air from his hand. He could feel the warmth of her, the pulse at the hollow of her throat, the strength that had remade his understanding of that word. He returned to the chair and allowed himself one long breath that left as prayer leaves, invisible but full. Near dawn, he rose and stepped outside. The east had just begun to pale. The ridge lay in a clean line against the sky, honest about its height, its distance, no movement now. The men had gone to gather meaner courage in some creek bed and would bring it back dressed as certainty. The law, he knew from an old world, does not always ride when it should, so you become law at your own threshold, not judge, not jury, only the hand that says enough. He stood there with the cool wood under his bare feet and thought of names. Men he had once known, women he had once loved, places he had once called home. The names did not cut him the way they used to, they held him. A list that had once been grief, now read like a map, every path ending at this porch, at this door, at this breath. Behind him, the house stirred. Nara rose, the soft sound of her dress like wind in young trees. She stepped into the doorway and watched the line of the hills with him. She did not ask if they would come. She did not say, "We will win." She laid the language of her presence across the morning and let it say what needed saying. "We will meet the day together." He turned to her and saw that the night had left no shadow on her face. It had left polish, the kind hardness gives to things that refuse to be ruined. He felt the urge to lay his hand on her cheek and did not, because restraint is also a kind of tenderness. Instead he said, "Today we mend the fence where the posts lean, and I'll fit a thicker brace to the porch." Ordinary promises, the kind that make the world obedient again. "And I will make bread," she said, "the kind that forgives." He smiled, and the smile reached a part of him he had kept behind bars so long he had forgotten what it was like to feel sun there. "I could use forgiving bread." "We all could," she answered, and the morning took the statement as its blessing. The first true light broke and fell like a quiet anthem across the yard. The house, the faces of a man and a woman who had decided to stay. Birds woke, but gently, as if the day itself knew to speak with care. Ayoka stirred inside and called once for her mother, the way a tide calls the moon. Nara turned to go, then paused and looked back at Jonas. The look was not a vow, not yet. It was something older and softer, like two travellers recognizing a road they had both dreamed of from opposite sides of a mountain. He nodded. She nodded. The sun lifted. Within the hour they would be at work, and by midday hunger and habit would weave their comfort. By afternoon a shadow might bruise the ridge again. If it did, they would stand. If it didn't, they would plant another foolish, beautiful thing. Whichever came, the heart had chosen its posture. It was not cowering. It was open, the way a door is open when it knows the hand on the latch belongs to a friend. And as the morning unfurled into a gold that made even splinters look holy, the house remembered its oath with them, to keep the wind honest, to keep the fire tamed, to keep 3 breaths steady beneath one roof, until Mercy was no longer a visitor but a resident with a favorite chair. The warning came on a wind that smelled of iron and dust. Jonas felt it before he saw it, the kind of hush that falls when the land holds its breath. He was mending a hinge on the corral gate when his hand stilled, the hammer mid-air, his gaze drawn to the cut of the horizon, as if the earth itself had whispered his name. A thin trail of dust hung beyond the ridge, almost nothing, a faint bruise against the pale sky. But he knew. Some part of him that had learned to read the desert the way a physician reads a pulse told him trouble was riding in. He turned toward the cabin. Through the open door, he saw Nara braiding Ayoka's hair, her hands gentle, her face soft with the kind of quiet that comes after a long winter. The sight struck him with a tenderness that ached. He did not want to break this fragile peace, but he would not lie to it either. "Nara," he called, voice low and even. She looked up. Her eyes found his, and something in his stillness sharpened her own. The braid slipped from her fingers. She rose without a word, the string of old instinct drawing taut between them. "Riders," he said. No panic crossed her features, only a narrowing of breath, a turning of the spirit toward whatever must be faced. She pulled the leather cord from her hair and wound it around her wrist. "How many?" "Can't tell yet." He glanced at Ayoka, who watched quietly, sensing the shift. "We'll make ready." The work unfurled with the grace of a ritual. Jonas brought in buckets of water, set extra kindling near the hearth, slid the old trunk to reinforce the back door. He moved with measured economy, every step the sum of a life that had prepared for storms. Nara gathered what she needed with the same calm. A handful of arrows wrapped with rags that could be lit, the knife she wore at her hip, the bow that had belonged to her father. Ayoka stood small and solemn by the table, fingers pressed to the wooden bird Jonas had whittled. Jonas knelt, so they were eye level. "Little one," he said softly, "I need you to be braver than the wind." He tapped the boards to the right of the stove, where a loose plank hid a crawl space. "You'll stay there until your mother or I call your name. Do you understand?" Ayoka nodded, her dark eyes wide but steady. Nara crouched beside them, cupping her daughter's face. "You are my heart," she whispered in Apache, a vow woven into every syllable. "Breathe slow. Think of the river. Think of the birds." Jonas lifted the plank. The space was narrow but warm, lined with a blanket and a small flask of water he'd put there months ago, a habit born of a mind that did not trust the world to be merciful twice. Ayoka slipped inside like a careful ghost. Nara pressed a kiss to her forehead. Jonas set the plank back, smoothed the rug over it. The cabin resumed its ordinary shape, the way a face composes itself after grief. They stood very still then, as if listening for the second hand of a clock hidden somewhere beneath the floor. The dust trail beyond the ridge thickened. 3 riders, then 5, then more. Jonas felt the rhythm of approaching hooves through the planks under his boots. He set the rifle on the table and worked the lever, the clean, metallic clasp of readiness filling the room. Nara's fingers brushed a coal from the fire into a small iron plate, the ember breathing orange against the rags she'd prepared. "I won't let them take this house," Jonas said. Nara's eyes lifted to his, steady as stone. "This house won't let them take us," she answered, and there was something like prayer in it, something like a promise made not only by 2 people, but by the walls and the wind and the earth beneath them. The first man crested the ridge with a grin that did not reach his eyes. He wore a fur-lined coat despite the heat, a whip coiled at his hip, his beard thick and oily with dust. He dismounted slowly, making a show of his ease, as if violence were a cordial he could sip at leisure. "Well now," he called out, spreading his arms. "Mr. Hale, heard tell you found a little something that wandered away from decent folks who do decent business. We're here to take what's ours. Name your price." Jonas stepped onto the porch. The boards thudded under his weight. He did not lift the rifle yet. The man's gaze flicked to the gun, then to Jonas's face. Men like him always looked too long, measuring where a person would break. He would find no crack to slip into here. "There's nothing for you here," Jonas said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the kind of weight that makes men listen even when they don't intend to. The bearded man clicked his tongue. "I can smell lies better than a coyote smells blood. Don't make this ugly. We'll be on our way with the woman, the girl, and whatever else you've been holding for yourself." He lifted his chin. "Boys." As if the sound were a lever, more riders fanned out. A dozen, maybe more, hungry the way fire is hungry. Jonas set the butt of the Winchester against his shoulder, the barrel still lowered but ready. The sky had turned white-hot above them, the kind of fierce light that bleaches shadows rather than banishes them. "Turn back," Jonas said. "I won't warn you twice." The man smiled, and it was a wound more than a kindness. "Then don't." The first shot cracked the air into shards. Jonas did not know which of them fired it. Perhaps it didn't matter. Once violence begins, it becomes its own author. He snapped the rifle up and sent a bullet slicing the distance, clean and precise. A rider pitched back, screaming, the desert swallowing the sound the way the ocean swallows a stone. Chaos spilled, fast as floodwater. Men shouted. Horses reared, the whites of their eyes wide as moons. Dust rose in choking curtains. Nara's arrow leapt from the doorway, a streak of fire born of ember and oil. It struck the bundle of tinder a man was hauling toward the porch. His mistake, to think he could set the house alight without the house lighting him first. The bundle exploded in flame, and he threw it down, flailing, the fire catching on the dry grass he'd walked through. A ring of burning began to writhe at the edge of the yard, and smoke lifted like a black veil. Jonas moved as he had once moved in places where the maps were written in fear, swiftly, with a calm that looked like grace. He worked the lever, fired, worked, fired. No wasted shots, no wasted breath. He felt the recoil in his shoulder, like the pulse of something he could still control. Between volleys, he saw Nara moving through the dim interior of the house with the swift patience of a storm. She'd dip a rag in oil, brush it across an arrowhead, kiss it with ember, and let it fly. When men drew close, the knife in her hand became an argument none of them could answer. A man tried for the back door, thinking to break where the wood was thinnest. Jonas pivoted and sent him tumbling into the doorframe, his pistol spinning from his hand into the scrub. Another leapt from his horse to rush the porch steps. Nara met him halfway, the knife flashing once, then twice, and he folded like a tent cut loose from its stake. The world narrowed. Time slowed, not as in dreams, but as in the moments when truth chooses to arrive. There were only the breaths they took, the ground beneath them, the taste of smoke, the promise they had made to one small heartbeat hidden under the floorboards. Amid the noise, another sound rose in Jonas's chest. A steadying drum, quiet and certain. It came from remembering that love is not fragile when it refuses to run. It is a tree that holds the hillside when the hillside tries to slide away. "Left!" Nara called, her voice a bell in the storm. Jonas turned as if he had been born to answer her voice. He saw the figure in the corner of his eye and fired. The man's shoulder erupted. He fell without his malice. A horse crashed against the fence, splintering a post. Jonas skirted the animal, soothed it with a hand on its flank, even as he stepped into a better angle. Kindness lived inside him like a second spine. It did not abandon him when the guns spoke. It could have gone all the way to ruin. Numbers have a way of believing themselves invincible, but fear frayed them. Nara's arrows set the edges of their courage on fire. Jonas's accuracy stitched their advance closed each time it tried to open. Men began to hesitate, to look for someone else to go first. The bearded man's grin collapsed into a snarl. He cracked his whip once, twice, like a preacher trying to summon faith from a congregation that has already lost it. He charged. Jonas drew a breath and let the world come to a singular point. He led the shot by a fraction, saw the man's weight shift in the saddle to compensate for the whip, and squeezed. The bullet kissed the air and took a piece of the man's side with it, a red flare blooming across the fur-lined coat. He yanked his horse back with a howl, hatred flashing in his eyes, not because he was wounded, but because someone had refused to be small. "Pull back!" he shouted, rage detonating into cowardice. "This isn't finished." The riders peeled away one by one, as all bad faiths do when they lose their hymn. They fled in a ragged arc, throwing up dust that glowed gold in the merciless light. The last of them fired a shot over his shoulder that buried itself in the porch railing. The house shuddered once, then became still. Silence did not fall at once. It receded like a tide. Jonas stood with the rifle lowered, listening to the wind reclaim its old music. Nara stepped onto the porch, smoke-streaked, a cut along her forearm weeping in a slow line. The fire circle at the yard's edge smouldered, the grass blackened like a cauterized wound. Jonas's gaze found the spot beside the stove. He crossed the room quickly, lifted the plank. Ayoka. The child's face appeared, smudged and bright, her eyes wet with the effort of being brave in a small space. Nara fell to her knees and gathered her daughter to her chest, rocking her once, twice, as if returning a heart that had been lent to the dark. Jonas exhaled a breath he had not known he was holding until it left him. For a moment, the cabin contained nothing but breathing, 3 human rhythms knitting themselves back together. "We're safe," Nara said into her daughter's hair. "We're safe." Jonas set the rifle aside and knelt beside them. He did not reach to touch them. He let the closeness itself be a blessing. The air smelled of smoke and iron, and the soft, clean scent of a child's scalp. In the doorway, the world wore a new color, the strange, silvery brightness that comes after fear has been asked to leave. When Ayoka fell asleep later, curled like a fawn upon the bed, Jonas cleaned the cut on Nara's arm with a careful hand. He tore a strip from an old shirt and wrapped it with the skill of a field medic, his fingers steady as he tied the knot. She watched him, eyes dark with 1,000 unsaid things. "You fight like rain," he murmured without looking up. "Patient at first, then everything is washed clean." Her mouth curved, a tired warmth. "And you fight like the mountain. You do not move." She paused. "Thank you." He met her gaze. "You don't owe me thanks." "I owe you truth," she said. "Once, men like that took my sister. We looked for her until the earth forgot our footprints. Today, I did not run. Today, I burned the path they tried to walk into our home." She turned her palm up, revealing a tiny coal burn on the pad of her finger. "Pain is a price, but this one feels clean." Jonas swallowed. Words crowded his throat and refused to smooth themselves out. He found another way. "You're hurt," he said, scanning her quickly for what she had ignored. She shook her head. "I have known worse." "This," she lifted the bandaged arm, "will be a line that reminds me I stood where I meant to stand." She let her hand fall to her lap. "Ayoka heard your voice and did not fear. That is a different kind of medicine." The room settled into a deep, kind quiet. Jonas poured water, and they drank like people come in from a long desert. He opened the window a crack to let fresh air comb the room. Sunlight slid along the floorboards like a river finding its old channel. The house, wounded in small ways, seemed to inhale and exhale with them, a living thing that had chosen them as much as they had chosen it. Outside, he doused what remained of the fire ring, shoveling dirt until the last red eye went black. He righted the fence post, spoke to the skittish mare in a low voice until her shivering eased. When he returned to the porch, Nara stood there with a cloth and a basin, wiping smoke from the railing, from the doorframe, as if she could lift the day's violence away grain by grain. He joined her, and together they cleaned what could be cleaned, making small things right, because that is how a soul steadies itself after shock. Evening came, gentle as a hand on a fevered brow. The sky turned the color of peaches, then embers, then soft ash. Ayoka slept without stirring. Nara and Jonas sat on the steps, shoulders nearly touching, their breaths making little clouds in the cooler air. The land that had been loud with gunfire now hummed with crickets, with the far-off yip of coyotes, with the faint clatter of a cottonwood leaf loosened from its branch. "They'll return," Nara said, "not as fear, but as fact." "Yes," Jonas answered. "Men like that don't forgive being denied." She turned her head. "We cannot run forever." "No," he said, "but we can be ready. We can be a place they cannot enter without losing what makes them men." She considered this, the line of her profile serene in the dim light. "In my mother's stories," she said slowly, "there were women who stood in doorways while storms raged, and the storms learned their manners." He smiled, a small, unpracticed thing. "Your mother was wise." "She was kind," Nara said. "Kindness is wisdom that has learned to walk." Jonas's chest tightened with a quiet ache. He had spent years building walls inside himself so that nothing could shake him. Today, a different architecture had held him up. Trust, shared purpose, the knowledge that he would stand in front of this door until the earth ended if it meant keeping these two breaths safe. He felt altered by it in ways he could not yet name. Night gathered. He lit a lamp and set it in the window, the glass ring winking like a small star. Inside, he checked the rifle, cleaned it, set it where his hand could find it blind. He covered Ayoka with another blanket, tucking it beneath her chin. When he turned, Nara was watching him, something luminous in her gaze, as if she saw a horizon inside him he had not known was there. "Thank you for the way you look after what you love," she said quietly. He shook his head, the denial on his tongue, but the truth rose instead. "I am learning how to love again," he said. "It feels like remembering a song I was sure had been buried." "Then sing," she whispered, and the word was not music, but permission, soft, healing, a blessing given without ceremony. He did not sing with his mouth. He sang with the way he banked the fire just so, with the way he set the buckets near the door, with the way he sat in the chair beside the bed and let his presence be a wall the dark could not cross. Nara lay down on the pallet a few feet away, one hand resting inches from her daughter's fingers. The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that can hold a heart without squeezing it. Sometime near midnight, Ayoka sighed in her sleep, a little sound that made both adults glance over even as they dozed. Jonas caught Nara's eye across the dim room. No words passed. They did not need them. Gratitude settled like warm dust. The night moved on its slow feet. Before dawn, Jonas stepped outside. The grass was silvered with dew, each blade a prayer. He stood on the porch and looked to the ridge, where the sun would soon climb. The air carried the faintest scent of rain, impossible maybe, but he chose to believe it. Behind him, the house creaked softly, wood easing, bones settling. Through the door, he could hear the faintest murmur of sleep, 2 breaths in gentle counterpoint. They had fought, and they had not broken. The land had watched. The house had held. The heart, his, theirs, had done something stranger and stronger than surviving. It had reached outward, gathered what it loved, and wrapped around it like a bandage that breathes. When he stepped back inside, the first birds had begun to speak. He set water to boil, ground coffee with the back of a spoon, the morning's ordinary holiness flowering in small sounds. Nara stirred, propped herself up on an elbow. Her hair fell in dark waves around her face. She looked at him as if waking into a life that might finally deserve the word. "Today," she said, her voice still wrapped in sleep, "we make the fence whole." He nodded. "And the door, and the latch, and the heart," she added softly. He met her gaze, a smile warming the edges of his mouth. "Especially that." The kettle whispered. Ayoka shifted and blinked, the wooden bird tucked under her arm like a faithful sentinel. Through the window, a line of light broke open the east. The darkness did not argue. It simply stepped back to make room. They ate, they mended, they cleaned the last traces of ruin. And beneath every task, a steadier music pulsed. The awareness that love is not a softness that yields to harm, but a strength that refuses to let harm define the story. This was not the end. The men would return, uglier for their first defeat. But when they came, they would find more than a man alone and a woman on the run. They would find a home with a spine, a circle of hands clasped, a gentle power that grew every time it was asked to hold. As the day opened, Nara stood at the threshold and lifted her face to the sun. Jonas joined her, shoulder to shoulder, the distance between them now a living thing that knew how to breathe without hurting. The prairie glittered with a promise the land keeps for those who have chosen to stay. The wind moved across the grass, warm and kind, carrying the scent of ash and coffee, and something like rain. It crossed the porch, touched the bandage on Nara's arm, brushed the wooden bird in Ayoka's hand, and went on to the horizon, where the next chapter waited, patient as a friend. Night came quietly, as if it had learned to step softly around the house that refused to break. The sky shed its last copper and settled into velvet, and the small lamp in the window turned the cabin into a humble star. The land exhaled. Crickets stitched together a delicate music, and somewhere far off a coyote released a lonely hymn that sounded less like hunger than a question asked to the dark. Inside, the air was warm with the breath of living. Jonas sat at the table with a whetstone and his pocket-knife, drawing steel along stone in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Nara sewed a torn shirt with steady hands, her stitches small and sure. Ayoka slept with the wooden bird pressed to her chest, the rise and fall of her breath, the kind of miracle that never stops being miraculous, the longer you look at it. Every now and then the lamp flame trembled in the glass and steadied again, like a heart teaching itself how to keep time. "You should rest," Jonas said, the words gentle, not a command, but a blanket laid across a tired soul. Nara didn't look up at once. Her hair fell in a dark waterfall over her shoulder, catching the lamplight in strands that shimmered like night water. "Rest feels like a door," she answered. "I have not trusted doors for a long time." She tied off the thread and bit it, the thread fraying in a small wish of white. Jonas set the knife down. "I know the way a door can turn into a trap. I know the way a bed can feel like an ambush when your body remembers too much." He paused. "But I think this room has chosen us. I think it remembers mercy." She lifted her gaze then, and he felt the old ache in his chest. How the softest things can hurt, because softness is freedom, and freedom is expensive after you've paid everything for it. "Did you have a room like this once?" she asked. He looked at the wall beside the hearth. "A different room. The light was closer to gold there. In the spring it smelled like lilacs. In the fall, like apples. I built a cradle with my hands and never used it. We thought we had time." He took a slow breath. "We didn't." Silence widened, but not in a painful way. It widened like a field that invites the sky to lie down in it. Nara set the shirt aside and came to sit on the floor near his chair, her back against the bed where Ayoka slept. She drew one knee up and rested her arm on it, the lamplight laying a bronze edge along the bandage he'd wrapped. "My husband died when the river failed," she said after a while. "It took cattle and crops, and then it took men. The ones who were left began to take from the ones who could not stop them. My sister disappeared into that dust. We have walked ever since. I thought I was becoming wind, untouchable. But wind is only what happens when the world is too empty." Jonas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the shadow of his jaw pronounced in the light. "You did not become wind." He shook his head. "When those men came, I saw the mountain inside you." A corner of her mouth lifted. "You speak like a man who once loved the land as if it were a person." "I never stopped," he said. Their eyes held, and for a moment the room seemed to lean closer, listening for a word that neither of them had said yet, because once spoken it would change the shape of everything that followed. The lamp flame bent and straightened. Ayoka sighed in sleep, a whisper of trust. Nara reached for the iron plate that still held a sleeping ember. With 2 practiced touches she coaxed it awake, then snuffed it again with ash, as if to prove to herself that fire could obey gentleness. "When I told you my body was yours," she said, looking at the ember's faint glow, "I was trying to put a law between us that I could hold, something I understood. Debts and vows, payment and protection. The world makes sense when it is made of bargains. Kindness unsettles me." "Why?" His voice was soft. "Because I do not know how to repay it. Because it asks me to be safe, and I do not remember how." She found his gaze, and the honesty in hers was unflinching. "You could have taken what I said and made it pain. Instead, you made it a shelter. That frightens me more than men with whips." Jonas nodded once, as if receiving a truth like that required a bow. "I don't want what fear would give me," he said. "I want what love would offer if it were ever given the choice." The word hovered there, luminous and fragile. Love. There was no thunderclap, no sudden music, only a soft rearranging of the air, as if the room itself had moved 2 inches closer to their bodies. It was not a confession about possession. It was a confession about courage. Nara looked toward the window, where the night pressed its forehead against the glass. "My mother used to say, 'Love is not a sweetness first. It is a strength. It is the hand that holds yours when the water is too high.'" She touched the bandage on her arm, as if touching the idea itself. "It does not take. It carries." Jonas felt something inside him give way, the good kind of giving, the kind that unknots a rope around the ribs. "Then let me carry what I can," he said. She was quiet for a long time. Then she rose and poured water into a tin cup, her hands steady. She drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and held the cup to him. He drank where her lips had touched, and the small intimacy moved through him like a warm river. When he set the cup down, she did not return to the chair or the distant corner. She sat on the low edge of the bed, one hand near Ayoka's foot, the other resting on the quilt. Jonas stayed where he was, close enough to feel the tide of her breath, far enough to honor a life that needed room to remember safety. "Tell me about your wife," she said. He did not look away from the lamp as he answered. She laughed with her whole body. She made bread that could forgive a bad day. She wanted a garden with hollyhocks. I told her this land was too hard for flowers like that. She told me I underestimated stubborn beauty. He smiled, brief and aching. She was right. "And the child?" Nara's voice was a leaf floating on slow water. His throat worked. "We never met," he said. "But I talk to them sometimes when the wind has that sound, when it's not empty but not full either. When it waits, I tell them about the color the mountains turn after rain, about the way a horse knows your footsteps, about the way a man can be broken and still be decent." "I don't know if they hear. It helps me to tell it." Nara's hand turned palm up on the quilt, as if she were asking the night to place something there. "They hear," she said with quiet certainty. "The ones we love always hear. That is what love means. It bends distance until the heart is close enough." He closed his eyes. The whetstone's fine grit was still in his fingers. The scent of oil and smoke and wool filled his lungs. He did not need to hold her hand to feel held. The room held them. The child's breathing held them. The land outside, vast and old, held them. When he opened his eyes, Nara was watching him with a softness he had not seen before. It was not pity, it was recognition, like a traveler finding a familiar constellation after months of cloudy nights. "You don't wear your sorrow like armor," she said. "You let it be skin. That is brave." "I didn't know how to do it any other way," he replied. "Armor rusts. Skin heals." She nodded, a slow assent that seemed to include more than the words. His house, her years, the fact of mourning itself. She stood and took the shirt she had mended, folded it neatly, and set it on the chair. Then she walked to the door and opened it. Cool air curled across the room, carrying sage and starlight. The sky was thick with stars, and between them the dark was soft instead of sharp. "Come," she said. He followed her onto the porch. The boards were cool through his socks. Night had loosened its shoulders. The coyotes had finished their psalms and gone quiet. Above them, the Milky Way spilled its dust like a road for lost souls to find their way home. Nara tipped her face up, closed her eyes, and breathed. "In my tribe," she said, "my father would stand with me like this and tell me the stories written up there." She lifted a finger to trace invisible lines. "That one is a hunter who learned to carry water for his enemies. That one is a woman who became a tree so the wind would stop. And that one," she pointed toward a cluster glittering like a fistful of salt, "is a child who forgave the night for being dark." Jonas smiled, the expression easing something tight along his jaw. "I don't know these stories," he said, "but I want to." "Then I will teach you," she said simply, "and you will teach me the names your people gave to this land I have walked without naming." They stood together in the gentle cold. The night touched the backs of their hands. He felt the wild urge to take her fingers into his, and didn't. The restraint was not fear. It was the first shy kindness lovers learn when they decide to love like caretakers instead of conquerors. The wind moved across the porch and took some of their weariness away with it. When they returned inside, the lamp had burned lower. Nara picked up the blanket from the chair and spread it over Jonas's shoulders before lying down beside Ayoka. He did not protest. The warmth climbed his back, and with it came the oldest, cleanest feeling, being looked after without debt. He banked the fire to a low glow and sat again, a sentinel whose watch was as tender as it was fierce. It rained a little just before dawn, not enough to soak the ground, but enough to lay the dust. The smell rose like a blessing. Ayoka woke smiling, the new air shining her eyes. She climbed into Nara's lap, hair tousled, and then wriggled toward Jonas, who lifted her and held her a moment longer than necessary, because the weight of a living child in his arms was a cure for injuries the world had told him would never mend. They ate quietly, coffee for the adults, hot milk for the child, bread, and the last of the jam Jonas kept for winters. The jam stained Ayoka's mouth red, and Nara laughed softly, wiping it away with the corner of her shawl. Jonas watched the two of them and felt his own mouth bend, not with the practice of courtesy, but with the ease of belonging. Later, with the day turned pearly and clean, they worked. He planed the door so it closed without sticking. She reinforced the shutter hinges with rawhide straps that would flex instead of snap when the wind wanted to prove its strength. Ayoka invented a game with small stones, circling them in patterns on the dried earth. Her hum filled the space between their movements like a small river does a canyon, patient, persistent, shaping. At midday, Jonas and Nara shared a piece of bread on the porch and half an apple left from a trader's recent visit. He quartered it with his knife and handed her the larger share without theatrics. She took it, and after a beat, handed him back the heart of the fruit, the sweet center, a wordless way of saying, "I see what you offer, and I want you to have what is good, too." A hawk hung in the sky, steady on a wind Jonas could not feel on the ground. The world held its notes, everything in tune for the length of a breath. If there is a kind of peace that is not careless but brave, they were inside it, not because danger had vanished, but because danger had been told what it could not take. As afternoon settled into the low light that makes long shadows and honest talk, they rested. Nara taught Ayoka a song about rivers finding the sea. Jonas listened, then hummed the third line, then joined the fourth, and by the sixth they were a chorus, the child's high voice ringing like silver thread through the cloth of the melody. When it ended, silence did not rush back rudely. It sat down beside them, companionable. "Will they come again?" Ayoka asked, surprising them both with the courage of her voice. Nara touched her cheek. "Men who want to take do not learn easily," she said. "But we have learned faster. We have learned together." Jonas nodded. "If they come," he said, "they will not find us afraid." Ayoka considered this, then nodded solemnly, as if she had signed a treaty with her own heart. She returned to her stones. Evening approached with clean hands. Jonas lit the lamp before the dark gathered, and Nara boiled water for a small pot of herbs that grew in shelter behind the shed. The tea smelled like grass after rain, and a memory he could not name. She handed him a cup, their fingers grazing, and the touch stepped deeper than skin as if it had been invited. He did not ask to hold her. He did not need to. The newness between them was not a candle that needed sheltering. It was the first ember in a hearth that planned to burn through winter. It asked for tending, not hurry. He gave it that. When night climbed the hills and lay down over the world, they returned to their places. The chair, the pallet, the child between, the lamp a modest moon. Jonas closed his eyes and felt the house breathe, and beneath that the steady, almost imperceptible hum of something that had found its pitch. Love, perhaps. Not the sudden kind that steals scents and makes reckless promises, but the patient kind that binds wounds and reads weather and learns the constellations by heart so it can always find the way home. Sometime after midnight, wind tensed across the fields in a line he remembered from other lives. He opened his eyes and let the old soldier in him sit up without panic. He listened long enough to be sure it was only weather. And then, no louder than a thread pulled through cloth, he heard a sound that was not the night. Far off, metal on rock. A horse stumbling where no horse should be at such an hour. He stood, quiet and careful, and stepped to the door. The dark lay wide and smooth, but he knew how to read edges. On the far ridge, a shadow slipped where the ridge should have been a single unbroken piece. He watched it resolve and vanish, resolve again. 2, 3. He did not wake them, not yet. He simply let the knowledge take its place. The world had remembered him, and not all remembering is kind. Behind him, Ayoka dreamed. her hand twitching against the quilt, as if she were tracing a river she would one day cross without fear. Nara slept on her side, face turned toward the child, her breath even, her mouth soft. Jonas watched them, the gravity in his chest, not despair, but devotion. The kind that has decided already what it will do when the door is asked to hold. He banked the fire lower and sat back down, the rifle close but not in his hand. Dawn would come early. Whatever moved on that ridge would not vanish with the dark. But the room was still the room, and it had chosen them, and he had chosen this chair, and the three of them together were a cord that would not break when plucked. Outside, the coyotes began their brief, odd hymn again, the one that sounds like laughter if you are lonely, and like blessing if you are loved. He listened, and let it be both. He tilted his head back, and let his eyes rest. Between the beats of his heart, he felt the soft insistence of healing doing its quiet work, knitting bone, steadying breath, widening the space inside him where love could live without making him a fool or a weapon. Morning would come, and with it whatever men the night had coughed up. He would meet them as he had met everything since the girl had eaten bread from his hand, and the woman had said her body was his, and he had refused to be a debt collector. He would meet them with a steadiness learned from mountains, and a kindness learned from women who kept singing even when the river dried up. He would meet them with the house at his back, and the child's laugh stored in his pocket like a talisman. And when the first silver thread of dawn slipped through the window and laid itself across the floorboards, he knew with the kind of certainty that needs no banner, whatever comes, we will not meet it alone. Dawn rose the way a careful hand lifts a sleeping child, slowly, with reverence, not to startle what is precious. The first thread of light slipped beneath the door and laid itself across the floorboards, a silver ribbon leading from the bed to the hearth. Jonas had not truly slept. He had kept to the chair with his rifle near, feeling the dark breathe, counting the small intervals between each coyote hymn, tasting the weather for the shape of what might come. He stood when the birds began to speak, the old soldier inside him loosening his shoulders the way a craftsman loosens his grip before precision work. Nara woke as if summoned by the same light. She turned toward Ayoka, smoothed a curl from the child's brow, then sat up. The cloth of her dress whispered as she moved. He watched her test her arm, the bandage steady, the pain a contained ember rather than a live flame. Outside, something shifted on the ridge, subtle, like a thought deciding to become an action. They were there in the night, Jonas said quietly. 2, maybe 3. One paused long enough to count us by the lamps we kept. Nara's gaze found the horizon before she found his eyes. They will seek to measure our breath before they try to steal it. She rose and crossed the room to the small window facing east. Today, we do not give them a house of fear to enter. He nodded. There was a gentleness in the way she said it that made the resolve steadier, not harder. The gentleness of a river that has learned rock is only a lesson in patience. He set coffee to boil, the grounds blooming with a scent that always made mornings bearable. Nara brewed the herbs she'd gathered, a cup for him, another for herself, a third to leave cooling should Ayoka wake thirsty. Healing moved through the small tasks, through the hot rim of a cup against a palm, the steam touching the face like a blessing. "Little one," Nara said, bending to whisper into Ayoka's ear, "today we are strong as the hills." The child blinked awake and did not ask why her mother chose such words so early. She took her cup of milk with both hands and drank in careful swallows, her eyes tracking the light like a small compass, learning a new direction. They ate bread and a slice of dried meat, no speeches, just the quiet labor of readying heart and house. Jonas checked the latch Nara had reinforced with rawhide. It held like a promise. He laid a line of sand along the porch rail to smother any spark that might leap from a torch. He set a bucket at each corner of the steps, water dark and still. Nara gathered the arrows she had made, counted them, and kissed the feathered ends as if greeting old friends. Her knife she honed and slid back into its sheath, the motion smooth enough to be a prayer. Ayoka brought the stones from her game in a small bundle of cloth and handed them to Jonas solemnly. "For luck," she said in a whisper the wind barely heard. He tied the cloth to his belt and touched her hair. "You are the luck," he answered, "but I'll carry these anyway." By full morning the sun had scoured the ridge clean of shadow, and that was when the riders came, not in a rush, but in a practiced curl, as if they believed shape could make them inevitable. The bearded man was with them, his coat patched where Jonas's bullet had taken a piece of him. The wound had not taught him reverence. Hatred sat on his face like an ugly crown. He reined in at a distance, learned wariness in the way his horse sidestepped the memory of yesterday's defeat. He lifted his voice as if he were offering bread rather than threat. "Hail! You made a mistake, taking what ain't yours. Give us the woman and the girl, and we'll leave your bones where they are." "Men with empty hands make the loudest demands," Jonas said, stepping to the porch, not lifting the rifle, not yet. "Ride on." The man chuckled, a sound like a tin cup dented too many times. "You ain't the law, you ain't the church, you're a man with a stubborn house. Houses burn, hail, women break, little girls cry." He leaned forward in the saddle. "Who taught you to think you could stop the world from doing what it wants?" Nara appeared in the doorway. She did not speak. She did not need to. The sight of her, upright, healed enough to stand, eyes clear as a night washed by rain, cut across the man's words like a blade of clean air. Jonas said, "The world is better behaved when a woman like her is watching." It should not have mattered, the quiet dignity of a sentence shared between two people on a porch, but words shape weather. Something in the men's line wavered, a small hitch, a crack where sunlight pours and grows. The bearded man saw it too, and bared his teeth as if to cauterize the doubt. "Do it," he snapped. They moved. And the day broke open. The first shots were clumsy, overlong, panicked by a courage they could not counterfeit. Jonas answered with precision, his body remembering pathways carved by necessity and now repurposed by love. The rifle was a steady exhale, the reload an inhale. He placed his feet where the porch boards did not groan. He watched the angle of sunlight to judge glare, the drift of dust to judge wind. Nara's bow sang, soft and deadly, her arrows finding the places where haste makes men clumsy. The hand that grabs a torch, the thigh when a rider stands in the stirrup to aim. They tried the back, as all cowards do, circling toward the thinner door. Jonas anticipated the pivot, already moving when their intention congealed. He cut through the house with the grace of a remembered grief, Nara turning with him as if they shared one mind. Ayoka slipped beneath the floor at Nara's nod, lips pressed together but dry-eyed, brave in the way a river is brave, flowing where the earth asks it to. "Hold," Jonas whispered, and the walls seemed to obey. A man with a scar like a split lip reached the rear latch. He never found purchase. Nara's knife flashed, low and fast, catching the tendon above his heel. He folded with a cry that was more surprise than pain, and Jonas's buttstock met his temple with the firmness of sleep. Another swung his pistol toward the window. Jonas dropped, fired, rose, and struck the barrel aside so the shot dug into harmless wood. They moved without hurry, and that, in a field of men who worship haste, was terrifying. Then the bearded man changed the key. He pulled his horse back and spun a length of chain with a hooked weight at its end. Twice it sang through the air. The third time it caught the porch post with a mean clank and tore a chunk free. Splinters jumped. The lamp in the window trembled. "Fire it!" he yelled, and a torch arced toward the eaves. Nara was already there, sand bursting from her hand like a small storm, smothering flame at the moment of its first mouthful. Jonas felt a fierce gratitude, as sharp and clean as the first taste of water after a day's ride. The bearded man saw the damp, dark mark where flame had failed to catch. He cursed and snapped the chain again, angling for a window. The hooked iron struck and scraped, bit and held. He gave it a cruel yank. The window frame screamed. Glass shattered into bright rain. For a second, chaos swarmed like bees roused from a rotting stump. Jonas stepped into that second. Calm gathered to him like a cloak. He let go of anger. It is a heavy thing when accuracy is needed. He aimed for the chain, where the hook met the iron ring, and fired. Metal sang, then failed. The hook fell limp. The bearded man flinched, not at the damage, but at the clean refusal to be dragged. Nara's arrow answered his flinch, not to kill, but to claim. It stitched a burning kiss into the tail of his coat, a bright warning that leapt to tuft and seam. He swatted it off, furious, dignity singed. The men around him saw the spectacle and felt the ritual flicker, their priest of cruelty, almost set dancing by a woman's fire. "Enough," he snarled. "Finish it." They came hard then, as men do when spectacle fails them. Jonas and Nara made the house into an instrument. The table became a barricade, the rafters a place to swing lantern light into an enemy's eyes, the hearth a barrier of heat that no breath wanted to cross. Bullets scored wood, but the house took them the way old trees take lightning, with memory and a refusal to be reduced to ash. Time did a strange thing. It both stretched and tightened, became rope and thread at once. Jonas felt the shape of every breath, the exact weight of the rifle in his hands, the precise strike of his boot against the floorboards. And under it all ran the steadying fact of why. The child's small heart beneath the floor, the woman's fierce calm at his side. The past had given him skill. The present gave him aim. The future, for the first time in years, gave him a reason. A bugle note broke the din, a long, piercing sound from beyond the far ridge. The men on the porch stilled as if the air itself had tightened around them. The bearded man's head snapped toward the sound with a predator's snarl that has learned too late there is a bigger beast. Through the dust rode a line of blue-grey. Soldiers, not many, but enough, their formation tidy, their rifles oiled and ready. The officer at the front lifted a hand and the line fanned, cutting off retreat smooth as a gate swinging shut. The bearded man lifted his gun in a last ugliness, and a warning shot from a soldier shaved the brim of his hat into a ragged question mark. Men who had been brave when they believed no one was watching suddenly remembered the shape of law. "Stand down," the officer called, voice plain as daylight. "By federal order, you are under arrest for trafficking and armed robbery." He pointed with the iron certainty of a man who has already written the paperwork. "Drop your weapons." Some obeyed because they could read outcomes. Others hesitated and were made to understand. In a minute that felt like a miracle drafted by human hands, the world righted itself in small, satisfying clicks. Pistols dropped, wrists bound, the bearded man's eyes burning not with triumph, but with the sour fury of a story ending in a chapter he had not chosen. Jonas lowered his rifle. The sudden quiet throbbed in his ears like surf receding. Nara stepped to the threshold, her breath lifting once, twice, as if to confirm the air was still fit to breathe. Ioka wriggled from beneath the floor and stood blinking in the new brightness, a fawn stepping from the grove. Jonas put a hand on her head and felt the warmth of her life under his palm. There are prayers too true for language. This was one. The officer approached the porch, eyes flicking from the broken window to the sand-smeared step, to the woman with the steady gaze and the man with the rifle held low, barrel down. "Mr. Hale," he said, tipping his hat, not unkindly. "We've been hunting these men a long time. Your lantern in the window helped me see which ridge to climb. Whoever sent word did it right." Jonas nodded once. He had no interest in glory. He had interest in endings that kept houses whole. "Ma'am," the officer said to Nara, and there was respect in the shape of the word. He saw the bandage, the knife, the child. He saw the line of a family drawn where none had been expected. He shifted his weight, as if honoring an altar. "Thank you," Nara said. It was all that needed saying, and it carried everything. The soldiers did their neat work. The bearded man looked back, searching for a curse that would change the weather. He found none. The chain dragged behind his horse like a tail that had lost its cruel flourish. Dust swallowed them. Silence opened, not empty now, but resonant, like a room after music, when the notes still shine on the walls. Jonas leaned his rifle in the corner and sat on the porch step. His hands shook then, now that the shaking would not ruin aim. Nara came and sat beside him, not touching, close enough that he could feel the heat of her arm. Ioka curled on the step below them, laying her head against Jonas's knee as if that had always been its purpose. They breathed. The world remembered to be gentle. "The law came," Nara said softly, more surprised than triumphant. "Sometimes it does," Jonas said. "Today it listened." She nodded. Her lashes cast small shadows on her cheek. "I have not trusted listening in a long time." She turned her face toward him. "I will try." He answered with a small sound that had begun to mean many things. He looked at the field, at the fence they had mended, at the narrow groove where the porch post had splintered under the chain. He saw not ruin, but record. The house had learned another way to stand. Inside, they cleaned slowly, the way you clean after a birth. Tenderly, without hurry, acknowledging that mess and miracle share a threshold. Jonas swept glass into a pan. Nara washed soot from the boards with water and a cloth, her motions patient as tide. Ioka stacked the fallen stones from her game into a small tower and blew on it with the solemnity of a blessing. When the last shard was gone and the floor dried, sunlight entered the room without snagging. It moved across the wood like a hand smoothing a wrinkled sheet. They ate, all three of them, less from hunger than from the body's need to anchor itself. Bread and beans, a cut of meat, the coffee still warm from the morning. There was a sweetness in the plainness of it. The way ordinary food tastes after a day's harm refuses to become a habit. In the afternoon, the officer returned to sign a paper and to press into Jonas's hand an envelope with the tidy heft of justice, warrants, a receipt for confiscated weapons, a promise that the men would stand in a room where words are weighed and measured. Jonas tucked the envelope into a drawer with a respectful thud, as if filing away thunder after a storm. When the soldier rode off, Nara stood in the doorway and exhaled. "I thought my life would be only moving," she said. "Step after step until my feet forgot their names." "And now?" Jonas asked. She looked at the cabin, at the bed, at the small stack of wood by the hearth. She looked at the hill, the line of road beyond, the thin, bright river they had not yet visited together. "Now I think about staying," she said. The words did not tremble. They landed and took root. Ayoka ran out into the yard then, her laugh ringing like a bell that belongs to a church, the land itself built. Jonas and Nara followed, the three of them making a slow circle without planning it, feet tracing a shape that felt like home. The air was warm, and the world wore the soft focus of afternoons after fear, when edges don't need to be sharpened to be true. "Let me see your arm," Jonas said. Nara held it out. He unwrapped the bandage, cleaned the cut, rewrapped it with a care that kept his hands steadier than earlier. She watched him as a student watches a teacher who is also a friend. When he finished, she did not pull back at once. Her forearm rested in his hands a heartbeat longer than necessity. Heat moved between skin and skin, not a fever, not a fire, but the steady exchange warmth makes when it decides to stay. "Thank you," she said. "You fought beside me," he answered. "It was not mine alone to win." "It was ours," she said simply. Evening came with a softness that made the day's brutality feel like a distant rumor. The sky spread its blue wide and quiet. Jonas lit the lamp, this time with ceremony. A small flame cupped, a wick that caught and held, a glass set gently, the light placed in the window, not as a signal for salvation, but as a sign to the night. We are here. We are together. Nara cooked a soup with what they had, adding herbs from the sheltered patch and a piece of dried meat cut fine. The scent filled the house, and the house seemed to widen to hold it. They ate with spoons that clinked softly against tin. Ayoka told a story in a mix of words and gestures about a hawk who needed a friend and a stone who became a bird. They listened as if the tale were scripture. In the way she told it, the stone did not have to leave what it was to learn how to fly. It learned to be stone and bird together. After the bowls were cleaned, they stepped outside. The first stars had come. A hush lay on the prairie that did not frighten. Nara leaned against the porch post, her shoulder close to where the chain had scarred the wood. She laid her palm over the mark, as if telling the post a gentle secret. "What did you say to it?" Jonas asked, his voice a murmur meant not to wake the night. "I told it. You did not break," she said, "and that I am proud." He looked at her hand, at the post, at the place where harm and praise met, and agreed to become memory instead of mastery. It felt like instruction, and he received it. Ayoka pressed the wooden bird into Nara's hands, then into Jonas's, back and forth, as if the toy were a torch changing the shape of darkness. "We fly now," she declared. "We do," Nara agreed, her eyes on Jonas. "We do," he echoed, and the words did not carry desperation or hyperbole. They carried the weight of a promise the land had overheard and decided to help keep. When night sat fully, the lamp in the window shone steady. Inside, they arranged themselves as before, chair, pallet, child. Yet nothing was the same. The room knew it. The air wore it. Jonas's breaths were deeper. Nara's shoulders were not pulled so tight, even when she slept. Ayoka sprawled like a creature who has learned that beds are rafts that do not sink. Jonas did not keep the rifle in his hands. He set it within reach, but chose a different vigil, watching the rise and fall of two chests, reminding the room quietly with his body that mornings were now the rule, not the exception. Healing moved in the wood, in the fabric, in the little clicks and sighs of a house settling. It moved in him, too, not like a parade, but like a tide that keeps its own counsel and keeps coming back. Before sleep took him, he thought of the bearded man's face when the law rode over the ridge. He did not relish it. He filed it. Not every enemy deserves a home in the mind. Then he let the thought go, the way you let a bad wind pass. He turned toward Nara and found her looking back, awake, eyes reflecting the lamp's low shine. For a breath, they simply held each other's gaze across the small distance, and the distance changed. It became a bridge. "Rest," she said, the single word warmer than any quilt. "I will," he answered, "if you will." "I will," she said. And that was the truest vow either had made in years. The lamp's flame drew down to a small, content pearl. The house listened to the night, and the night, for once, agreed to listen back. Out beyond the ridge, the road ran on, indifferent to love and law alike. Here, in this small square of light and wood and breath, a new ordering took hold. Not that danger had ended, but that love had learned the geography and would not be misplaced again. Morning would bring work and the slow rebuilding that follows any battle worth winning. Morning would bring laughter, too, because it had learned the route. And somewhere along that morning's edge, where coffee meets song, where bandage meets skin, where two pairs of hands learn the heft of belonging, something unnamed would step through the door and choose a chair. It would sit down between them and stay. The prairie turned its face to the stars and glowed in a quiet way. The wind moved like a lullaby between fence posts and through the chinks where old houses whisper to themselves. Jonas's last thought before sleep was simple and whole. This is our home. Nara's last thought was an answering chord, and I am not alone inside it. Ayoka dreamed of stone birds and rivers that knew their way without asking. And beyond the window's soft halo, where the land meets the long line of the world, a new day waited with patient hands, ready to lift the next piece of their life and set it gently into place. The prairie glowed gold that morning, a wide hush stretching from horizon to horizon, as if the land itself had paused to breathe. Dew clung to the grass like 1,000 small prayers catching sunlight, and from the cabin's chimney rose a thread of smoke, thin and steady, curling into the cool blue of the sky. Inside, the air carried the scent of bread and wood fire, a scent that spoke of peace after a storm, of wounds that had finally begun to knit in silence. Jonas stood by the window, mug of coffee in hand, his grey eyes soft now, no longer scanning the distance for danger, but watching the child and her mother move in easy rhythm around the table. It was the same house, the same morning light, but it had learned a new language, one written in trust, warmth, and the quiet grace of beginning again. Ayoka's laughter fluttered like birds through the open window. She was telling her mother a story about the stone that wanted to become a bird, and Nara listened with her head bent, the loose braid brushing her shoulder. Her smile, rare, once guarded, now came easily, unafraid of its own tenderness. Jonas could not remember the last time he had seen a smile that felt like home. It reached him before she looked up, before her eyes found his. When they did, no words were needed. Everything they had endured had already been spoken between them through fire, silence, and shared breath. He stepped closer, drawn by something both fragile and strong, the invisible thread that had been weaving itself through their days. "You've made peace with the fire," he said, nodding toward the hearth where the bread was rising. She glanced at the flames. "Fire burns," she replied, "but it also teaches. It makes room for warmth when you learn not to fear it." He smiled. "Like people." Her gaze held his for a heartbeat longer than it needed to. "Yes," she said softly, "like people." The words hung in the air, simple but true. He could feel them settle deep in him, smoothing the rough edges time had left. Healing isn't a sudden burst of light, he thought. It's the steady hand that keeps tending the flame after the wind passes. They ate together at the table, 3 bowls, 3 lives stitched together by something that no longer needed to be named. The bread was imperfect, too dense in the middle, but Jonas swore it was the finest meal he had tasted in years. Nara pretended to scold him for lying, though her eyes were bright with pride. Ayoka giggled, her laughter spilling warmth into every corner of the cabin until even the dust motes seemed to dance to its rhythm. After breakfast, Jonas repaired the fence while Nara gathered herbs from the patch behind the shed. The earth was still scarred where the battle had burned through the grass, but shoots of green had begun to push up, small signs of mercy written in root and stem. He watched her move through the sunlight, her steps sure, her skirt brushing the plants she'd nurtured. The sight filled him with something he could not name, something quieter than desire but more powerful than gratitude. She was the living proof that beauty could survive ruin. When she returned, he was waiting with a bucket of fresh water and a small handful of seeds. "The hollyhocks," he said. "They're sprouting." She knelt beside him, pressing her fingers into the soil, feeling the small pulse of life hidden beneath. "They'll grow stubborn," she said. "The land remembers kindness." He nodded, his voice low, "and forgiveness." They worked in silence, side by side. The warmth between them wasn't urgent. It was patient, like the rhythm of the seasons. Every glance, every touch of hands over the same patch of soil was a soft echo of something larger than words. Ayoka ran circles around them, carrying a stick like a banner, her laughter the anthem of a new world. By noon, the wind shifted. A gentle rain began to fall, rare, sweet, and healing. Nara lifted her face to the sky, letting the drops trace paths down her skin. Jonas watched her, unable to look away. Her eyes closed, and a faint smile curved her lips. The rain soaked through her hair, darkening it to ink, glistening on her cheekbones. He stepped forward, drawn without thought, until he was close enough to see the small tremor in her breath. "You should come in," he said softly. Her eyes opened. "It's been a long time since rain fell on me," she whispered. "Let it fall." He hesitated, then stepped into the rain beside her. For a while, neither spoke. They simply stood there, the earth damp beneath their boots, the air heavy with the scent of dust and water. The rain washed the soot from the wood, the old scars from the porch, the bitterness from memory. When she looked at him again, her expression was different, unguarded, almost luminous. "Jonas," she said, barely above a whisper, "do you ever think we were meant to find each other?" He met her gaze, the rain trailing down his face. "I don't know about fate," he said, "but I know peace when I find it." Her breath caught, and for a moment the world seemed to still. Ayoka's laughter drifted from the cabin, light and clear, anchoring them in the present. Nara smiled faintly. "Peace," she repeated. "I like that word." "Then keep it," he said. "It suits you." Later, when the rain faded and the light returned, they sat on the porch, sharing a blanket as the sun slid down behind the ridge. Ayoka dozed against her mother's lap, the wooden bird still clutched in her hand. The air was cool, fragrant with wet grass. Jonas's hand brushed against Nara's beneath the blanket, by accident, then on purpose. She didn't pull away. Their fingers laced together, quietly, naturally, as if they had been meant to fit all along. He spoke after a while, his voice barely more than a breath. "I used to think I was meant to live alone, that some men were built only for silence. But when I hear her laugh, when I see you smile, the silence feels smaller, the world feels wider." She turned her head toward him. "You were never meant to be alone," she said. "You were just waiting for the right silence to share." Her words fell into him like sunlight through glass, soft, unhurried, steady. Something inside him, long dormant, began to bloom again. He lifted her hand and kissed it gently, his lips tracing the lines of her palm like a promise. She didn't pull back. Her breath trembled and then steadied, as though her soul had found somewhere safe to rest. Night came tenderly. The sky filled with stars, bright and endless, each one a story waiting to be retold. Jonas lit the lamp in the window. Its glow joined the starlight, a small human constellation declaring itself to the dark. "We are here, and we have survived." Nara leaned against his shoulder, and for a long while they sat like that, their silence warm, the kind that heals instead of haunts. Inside, the house sighed with contentment, the slow creak of wood, the faint hum of wind through the cracks, the heartbeat of a place that had finally learned to hold life without trembling. "Tomorrow," Nara murmured, "we'll teach Ayoka to ride." Jonas smiled. "She'll race the wind before the season turns." "And we'll build a swing in the tree by the field," she added. "And plant more flowers," he said. Their words braided into each other like threads of the same dream. Tomorrow they would live. Not just survive, but live. The way grass grows through ashes, the way dawn insists on returning, no matter how long the night. He looked out at the horizon, where the moonlight touched the tips of the grass, turning every blade to silver. "I used to think this land was empty," he said quietly, "but it was just waiting to be filled with the right kind of sound." "What sound is that?" she asked. He turned to her. "Laughter and love." She smiled, the kind of smile that held both gratitude and promise. "Then let's keep it full." He drew her closer, their foreheads resting together as the wind swept around them. soft, healing, endless. Ayoka stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about wings, and Nara brushed her daughter's hair gently. Jonas felt the warmth of them beside him, the rhythm of life finding its song again. The night didn't feel cold anymore. When sleep came for them, it was light as breath, and the stars above kept quiet watch. The prairie stretched vast and kind beneath them, no longer wild, no longer cruel, just alive. And in that stillness, the story that began with fear ended with belonging. A man who had once lost everything had found a home. A woman who had once run from the world had learned to stay. A child who had once been silent now filled the air with laughter that sounded like salvation. The cabin on the edge of the prairie became more than shelter. It became testimony to mercy, to resilience, to the truth that love, once given room, always returns stronger than the wind. If you felt something in this story, if it reminded you that healing can come even after fire, that love can bloom from loneliness, leave your heart in the comments below. Let me know if this tale found a home in you the way it did in me. Tap the like, share it with someone who needs warmth today, and subscribe so we can keep building these quiet worlds together. Stories of light, forgiveness, and love that endures like the sun over the wide, open prairie.